I went to my wife's secret meeting at the funeral home to catch her red-handed. But when I saw the young man's face through the chapel window, I had to grab the doorframe to keep from falling. That was 8 months ago. I'm still not sure I made the right call about what I did next. My name is Arthur, and I'm 57 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the county, mostly bridges and drainage systems, the kind of work nobody notices until something breaks. I retired early, about 2 years ago, after my left knee decided it had carried enough weight to cross enough job sites. My wife Elaine is 53. She's a hospice social worker. She helps dying people get their paperwork in order and makes sure their families don't fall apart in the waiting room. She's been doing it for 19 years. I always thought it took a particular kind of person to do that work and come home and still have something left to give. I thought she was that kind of person. We met when I was 26 and she was 22. I was at a cookout at a friend's house, standing near the grill because I didn't know anyone, and she walked up and asked me if I actually knew what I was doing, or if I was just standing there looking useful. I told her I was definitely just standing there looking useful. She laughed. That was it for me. We got married 14 months later. We bought a small ranch house in Roanoke, Virginia. We had a daughter, Lily, who is now 28 and lives in Portland. For a long time, I thought we had a good life. Not a glamorous one, not a perfect one, but a solid one. The kind you build slowly and don't think to appreciate until you're afraid of losing it. I first noticed something was off about 18 months before all of this. Elaine started keeping her phone face down on the counter. She'd always been careless with her phone before, leaving it anywhere, never minding if I glanced at it. The face down thing was new. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. She worked with grieving families all day. Maybe she just needed some distance from her screen at home. I wanted to believe that. Then came the late evenings. She'd always been home by 6:30, sometimes 7 if a patient had a bad day, but she started coming home at 8, 8:30, occasionally 9. She always had a reason, a family in crisis, a patient who'd taken a turn, discharge paperwork that couldn't wait. I believed her, mostly because she'd spent nearly 2 decades giving me no reason not to. The thing that finally cracked it open was small. It's always something small. I was looking for the car insurance renewal in her email. She handles all our paperwork, always has, and she'd left her laptop logged in on the kitchen table. I wasn't snooping. I genuinely needed the document. But when I opened the browser, her inbox was already up, and a name jumped out at me that I didn't recognize. Not a work address, a personal Gmail. The subject line said simply, "Thank you for yesterday." I stared at that for longer than I want to admit. Then I closed the laptop and went and sat in the backyard for about 45 minutes watching the neighbor's dog run circles in their yard. I didn't confront her that night. I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready to hear the answer. Maybe some part of me thought if I left it alone long enough it would sort itself out. I know how that sounds. I'm not proud of it. Over the next 3 weeks, I paid attention in a way I never had before. She started mentioning a name just casually, in passing. A client's adult son who was having a hard time with his mother's decline. She said he reminded her of the young men she worked with sometimes. The ones who'd never learned how to grieve, who'd missed their fathers growing up and didn't know how to sit with death. She seemed to care about him quite a lot. She said his name was Cole. I looked up the name in her phone one afternoon while she was in the shower. There were 47 text messages in 3 weeks. I didn't read them all. I read enough. They weren't explicit. That almost made it worse. They were tender, careful, the kind of messages you write when you're trying to hold something precious without breaking it. She called him sweetheart once. He called her the only person who's ever actually seen me. I put the phone back exactly where it was. I went and made dinner. I don't remember what I made. Here is the part I am still ashamed of. I didn't say anything for another 2 weeks. I just watched. I told myself I was gathering information, but the truth is I was terrified. I was 56 years old and I didn't know who I was without this woman. I built everything around her, the house, the retirement plan, the idea of what my life was going to look like. I kept thinking about Lily, about what it would do to her. I kept thinking about 30 years of Christmases and inside jokes, and the way Elaine still reached for my hand in movie theaters without thinking about it. I kept thinking, how do you grieve a person who's still standing right in front of you? It was a Tuesday when things broke open. Elaine told me she had to visit a family. The mother of her client Cole had passed the previous Friday, and she wanted to attend the private memorial that afternoon. She said it as though it was routine, completely calm. She even kissed me on the cheek when she left. I waited 20 minutes. Then I got in my truck and drove to the funeral home she'd mentioned. It's a small place. Whitmore and Sons, on the edge of town, the kind that's been there since before anyone currently living can remember. I parked across the street and sat there for a while, feeling ridiculous. I'm a 56-year-old retired engineer sitting in a pickup truck outside a funeral home to spy on my wife. I had a thermos of coffee. I felt like a bad actor in a movie nobody would want to watch. She was already inside. Her car was in the lot. I sat there for about 20 minutes. Then I got out, because I'd driven all the way there and I needed to know. I walked around the side of the building where there was a small window, frosted but partly open at the top, overlooking the chapel. I could hear voices. I could see shapes through the glass. Then a door to my left opened, a side entrance, and a man stepped out alone. Young, early 30s. Dark hair, a little grey at the temples already. He was wearing a navy suit and he'd loosened his tie. He was looking at his phone and didn't see me at first. When he looked up, I was maybe 15 feet away. I don't know how to explain what happened to me in that moment. It wasn't a slow realization. It was instant. The way a light comes on. Not a gradual brightening, just dark. And then not. He had my jaw, my brow, my ears, slightly too large and set just a little too high on his head, which is a thing I've been self-conscious about since 7th grade. He was taller than me, and his eyes were darker, and he had his mother's nose, whoever his mother was, but the rest of him looked like a photograph of me at 30 that nobody had ever taken. He said, "Can I help you?" politely. Like he thought maybe I was a late arrival who'd gotten turned around. I said, "I'm sorry. I thought this was the entrance." My voice came out steady. I have no idea how. He nodded and held the door open, and I thanked him and walked past him into the building. I found a bathroom immediately, went inside and stood over the sink with the water running for a long time. My wife came into the world at 23 years old, having given up a baby. I know this because she told me once, 6 years into our marriage, on a night when she'd had more wine than usual, and we were sitting on the back porch, and she said there was something she'd never told anyone, and she needed to say it out loud at least once before she died. She'd gotten pregnant at 19 in college by a boy who left before she finished the sentence. She'd carried the baby to term and signed the papers and never told her parents, and spent the next 4 years trying to forget it had happened. She said she'd thought about it every single day since. She said she was sorry she hadn't told me before we got married. I'd held her hand and told her it didn't change anything. I'd meant it completely. What she did not tell me, what I had not known until I was standing in a bathroom at Whitmore and Sons with cold water running over my wrists, was that she had apparently found him. I don't know when. I don't know how long she'd known who he was. I don't know how long they'd been talking before he became her client's son. I don't know how much of what I thought I understood about the past 2 years was real. What I know is that when I walked back out into the hallway, Elaine was standing there. She saw my face, and she knew immediately that I knew, not everything, but enough. The color left her completely. She looked the way people look when they've been bracing for an impact for a long time, and it finally arrives, and it's somehow still worse than they imagined. She said my name. Just that. I said, "Not here." We drove home separately. The 20 minutes on the road alone were the longest of my life. I kept thinking about the young man's face. I kept thinking about Elaine at 23, alone, signing papers. I kept thinking about 30 years and a house and a daughter in Portland who didn't know any of this. I kept thinking about the text message. The only person who's ever actually seen me. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. No wine, no pretense. Just sitting there with her hands flat on the table like she was waiting to be sentenced. I sat down across from her. I said, "Tell me all of it." She did. She'd hired a search consultant 4 years ago, quietly, using her own account, a little money at a time so it wouldn't show up anywhere I'd notice. She'd found Cole 18 months later. He'd been raised in Charlottesville by good people, she said, a schoolteacher mother, a father who coached youth baseball. He'd grown up not knowing he was adopted until he was 19, which is when she found out he'd started looking too. By the time her consultant found him, he was 29 and working as a contractor and caring for his adoptive mother, who had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. She'd written him a letter. He hadn't responded for 4 months. Then he had. They'd be meeting for coffee, occasionally lunch, for about 8 months before she started working with his family, which happened because his mother's decline accelerated and he didn't know where to turn, and she was the only person he'd told about any of it. She said she knew how it looked. She said she'd been trying to figure out how to tell me for 6 months, and every time she tried to start the conversation, she convinced herself she needed just a little more time. She said the texts, the sweetheart. She said that had happened once, early on, and she'd caught herself and pulled back, and she swore to me that nothing else had happened, that it had never been anything other than what it was, which was a mother trying to hold on to something she'd been letting go of for 30 years. I sat with that for a long time. She let me. I said, "Does he know who you are to him? Does he know you're his mother?" She said yes. He knew from the letter. I said, "Does he know who I am?" She looked at me. She shook her head slowly. "I didn't know how to explain you," she said. "I didn't know if you'd want to be explained." I thought about the young man in the navy suit holding the door open for me like a stranger. My jaw. My ears. His whole life built around people who were not me, not us. And then one day, a letter arrives and reconfigures everything he thought he knew. I asked her to give me some time. She slept in the guest room that night. And the night after that, we talked, carefully, like people handling something fragile. I called Lily and didn't tell her anything, but it was good to hear her voice. I went for long drives. I sat in the parking lot of the Home Depot on Route 419 for 45 minutes one afternoon, because I just needed somewhere to park and think that wasn't home. Here's the thing I kept coming back to. She'd lied to me. She'd hidden this for 4 years and let me go on not knowing. And that's a real thing. That's not nothing. I had every right to be angry. I was angry. I am still in some ways working through that. We're in counseling now, the two of us. And the therapist does not let me skip past that part, which I appreciate, even when it's uncomfortable. But I also kept thinking about what it had cost her. Not the finding, but the carrying. 30 years of wondering if he was okay, if he was loved, if she'd done the right thing. 30 years of every single day. I had told her once, on a back porch, that it didn't change anything. And I'd meant it. The question I had to answer, the one I'm still answering, is whether I still meant it, now that she'd gone further into that story than I knew. About 3 weeks after the funeral home, I called Elaine into the living room and I told her I wanted to meet him, not as her husband, who was furious, not as a confrontation, not to make any of it harder than it already was. I just wanted to look him in the face with the lights on and the doors open and no pretense between any of us. She called him that evening. She told him her husband knew and that he'd asked to meet. She said he was quiet for a long time. Then he said okay. We met at a diner in town. Neutral ground, my choice. I got there first and sat in a corner booth and ordered coffee and tried to look like a normal person having a normal morning. He came in wearing a canvas jacket and work boots just off a job site. He was taller than I'd registered the first time. He walked like someone who was used to measuring things before he touched them. Careful, deliberate. He slid into the seat across from me and ordered coffee, and we both looked at each other for a moment. I said, "I owe you an apology. I'm the one who was outside the funeral home. I wasn't supposed to be there." He looked at me for a second and then something shifted in his face. "I thought you looked familiar," he said. "I couldn't figure out why." I said, "Take a look. I think you can probably figure out why." He did. And I watched the realization move through him, slow and then all at once. He didn't say anything for a while. We talked for 2.5 hours. I don't want to give you every word of it, because some of it belongs to him, and I don't think it's mine to share. What I'll tell you is that he's a good man, thoughtful. He has a dry humor. He doesn't use very much, but when he does it lands exactly right. He asked me questions about my work, genuinely curious. He told me about growing up in Charlottesville, about his dad teaching him to frame a wall when he was 12, about the particular specific grief of watching your parent disappear piece by piece while they're still breathing. At one point he said, "I'm not looking to replace anything. I don't need a new family. I have a family." He said it clearly and without apology, and I respected him for it. I said, "I understand. I'm not trying to offer you one." He said, "Then what are you trying to offer you one?" He said, "Then what are you trying to offer?" I thought about it. I said, "The truth, I guess. And the door left open if you ever want to use it." He nodded slowly. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Then he said, "She talks about you. She didn't tell me much, but the way she said your name, I could tell she's afraid of losing you." I didn't answer that. I just held on to it. When we left, I shook his hand. He gripped it the way his grandfather used to. My father, a man he'd never met, firm, 2 full pumps, and let go. I don't know if he knew. I don't think he did. I sat in my truck for a long time after he drove away. I won't tell you things are easy now because that's not true. Elaine and I are still finding our way back to each other, and some days are better than others, and some days I look at her across the dinner table and feel a distance I don't quite know how to cross. But we're trying. We both want to try. That still counts for something, even when it's hard to feel it. Cole and I have exchanged a few texts since then. Nothing significant. He sent me a photo of a retaining wall he built on a hillside property, just because he thought I'd have an opinion. I texted back my opinion. He said I was probably right. It's not a relationship. I don't know if it ever will be, but it's a door left open. I'm 57 years old, and I've spent most of my life believing that the structures that matter are the ones you can see, the ones you can measure and load test and inspect. What I know now, maybe for the first time, is that the most important ones are invisible. They're made of decisions and silence and the grace you choose to extend to people who don't necessarily deserve it. They hold up the same weight. They fail the same way when you ignore them. I went to that funeral home to catch my wife in a lie. What I found was a story I didn't know I was already part of. I'm still deciding what to build with that. I've thought a lot about what it means to finally see something clearly after years of looking right at it and missing it completely. When I followed Elaine to that funeral home, I was operating on pure fear dressed up as resolve. I told myself I needed the truth. What I really needed was confirmation of the story I'd already written in my head, the one where she was guilty and I was wronged and the path forward was obvious. That story was easier than the one I actually got. The thing about fear is that it makes you a bad reader of people. I've been reading Elaine wrong for months, not because the signs weren't there, but because I was only looking for the one explanation that made sense to my fear. I never once considered that a woman who had carried a secret grief for 30 years might be doing something complicated and human and not entirely reducible to betrayal. I'd stopped giving her that much credit. That's on me. What I found when I actually sat with the truth, all of it, not just the parts that fit my narrative, was that Elaine had made a series of choices, some of them wrong, all of them made under the weight of something I hadn't fully understood, even after 30 years of marriage. She should have told me when she found Cole. That's not a small thing. The silence cost us, and we're still paying that bill. But I also had to ask myself honestly, had I ever made it easy for her to bring the hardest things to me? Had I been the kind of husband who left the door open for the conversations that don't have clean endings? I wasn't sure I had. Cole didn't ask for any of this either. He was a man in his early 30s trying to care for a sick parent. And somewhere in the middle of that grief, he'd had to absorb the fact that his origins were more complicated than he knew, and that the woman who showed up to help his family through the hardest stretch was also the woman who'd signed the papers 30 years ago. He handled it with more steadiness than I probably would have at his age. That kind of steadiness doesn't come easy. It comes from people who raised him right, and from choices he made quietly, over time, about who he wanted to be. What I took from all of it, and I'm still taking it slowly, is that the people we love are not simple. They carry histories we don't always have access to, and those histories shape decisions that can look like lies from the outside and something else entirely from the inside. That doesn't mean the lies are fine. It means the full picture requires more patience than anger usually allows. Arthur at 57 is still learning that. I keep coming back to something Elaine said to me the night everything came out. She said she'd been trying to figure out how to explain me to Cole, and she didn't know if I'd want to be explained. That sentence stayed with me because it meant she'd been protecting me, in her way, even while she was keeping me in the dark. There's something both infuriating and deeply human about that. It doesn't cancel the hurt, but it changes the shape of it. I went to that diner and shook Cole's hand and left the door open because it was the right thing to do. Not for Elaine, not even for him. For the version of myself I want to be when this is all said and done. A man who, when given the choice between closing a door and leaving it open, chose to let some light through. That's the only thing I know for certain, that I did right in any of this.